Let's move on to Book 4. Augustine there laments the death of a good friend. They were very close for a little more than a year, and then his friend got sick. Well, it looked like he was about to recover, and then he took a turn for the worse and died. While Augustine was away, he didn't even get a chance to say goodbye. Augustine was shattered by this, and much of Book 4 consists of his wrestling with the depression that caused. Now, some scholars have looked at this and thought there's something very strange about this, but I find that a remarkably callous reaction. I have had good friends die recently, and it's a difficult thing at any age. But if this happens to you when you're the age he was, when you're in your teens, then I think it's even much more difficult. That's an enormously difficult thing for someone to get past. It has a huge impact on the remaining friend's life. And so that happened to Augustine here. His best friend died. And it was something that shattered him. He really couldn't understand. He sank into a depression. He says, I had become to myself a vast problem. He was miserable. Everywhere he looked, he felt the absence of his friend. And so he wasn't sure what to do. He didn't know how to get out of that, how to get back on a proper path. He had the sense, after reading Cicero's Hortensius, that he had to turn himself toward the more eternal things. But this threw him off the path completely. And suddenly he found himself lost, shattered, unable to regroup. And so, how was he able to get past that? I was in misery, and misery is the state of every soul overcome by friendship with mortal things, and lacerated when they're lost. Then the soul becomes aware of the misery, which is its actual condition, even before it loses them. At the time, that was my state. I wept very bitterly and took my rest in bitterness. I was so wretched that I felt a greater attachment to my life of misery than to my dead friend. Although I wanted it to be otherwise, I was more unwilling to lose my misery than him. I was in misery, and misery is the state of every soul overcome by friendship with mortal things and lacerated when they're lost. Then the soul becomes aware of the misery, which is its actual condition, even before it loses them. At that time, that was my state. I wept very bitterly and took my rest in bitterness. Recall the very opening paragraph. Our soul is restless until it rests in you. Well, here he was taking his rest in bitterness. I was so wretched that I felt a greater attachment to my life of misery than to my dead friend. And here he starts realizing he is so deep in mourning that he begins to become attached to his state of mourning, attached to his own misery, attached to his own sorrow. I suppose that the more I loved him, the more hatred and fear I felt for the death which had taken him from me, as if it were my most ferocious enemy. I thought that since death had consumed him, it was suddenly going to engulf all humanity. That was, to the best of my memory, my state of mind. So he was shattered by grief, and so sunk in grief he didn't see a way out, began to fall in love with his own state of grief. He says, I could not escape from myself. Where should my heart flee to in escaping from my heart? Where should I go to escape from myself? Where is there where I cannot pursue myself? And yet I fled my hometown, for my eyes sought for him, less in a place where they were not accustomed to see him. And so from the town of Thagast I came to Carthage. Now in Carthage he begins to get involved in day-to-day affairs. Time is not inert, he says. It doesn't roll on through our senses without affecting us. Its passing has remarkable effects on the mind. And so time eventually began to heal him. He got involved in the life of being a student in Carthage. And it helped somewhat, partly just to be in a place where he wasn't reminded of his friend, and partly just to be taken up with other day-to-day activities. He says not everything grows old. His friend didn't, but everything dies. They rush toward non-being. What does that tell us? It tells us insofar as we get attached to those things, we're bound to suffer pain. They cannot provide the ultimate fulfillment for our life. He says, let these transient things be the ground on which my soul praises you, God, creator of all. They do reveal God's greatness. God has created all these things, even these transient things that will pass away. And their glory helps direct us toward the glory of God. But insofar as we become attached to them, we are missing the point. The thing we must become attached to is God himself. God lasts. God is eternal. But the things he's created, however glorious, however wonderful, however much we love them, are transient. They pass away. Let our souls not become stuck in them and glued to them with love through the physical senses, for these things pass along the path of things that move toward non-existence. They rend the soul with pestilential desires, for the soul loves to be in them and take its repose among the objects of its love. But in these things there's no point of rest. They lack permanence. They flee away and can't be followed with the bodily senses. No one can fully grasp them even while they're present. Nevertheless, he says, there is a place. There is a place of undisturbed quietness, where love is not deserted if it does not itself depart. What is that place? Well, it's the place of love of God. God persists. God's love remains. There would be more delight in all the elements than in individual pieces, if only one had the capacity to perceive all of them. But far superior to these things is he who made all things, and he is our God. He does not pass away. Nothing succeeds him. We get a section near the end of Book 4 where we return to the theme of Plato's philosophy and that idea of being pointed in the right direction, moving from the representations to the objects represented, to the forms, the abstractions, and eventually to God. In Plato, the form of the good is at the top of this realm of forms. For Augustine, it's God. He says, I enjoyed reading them, that is to say, the books that I was able to get a hold of as a student in Carthage, though I didn't know the source of what was true and certain in them. I had my back to the light, and my face toward the things which are illuminated. So my face, by which I was enabled to see the things lit up, was not itself illuminated. Here he's describing not merely his own state of mind, but the nature of the human condition, the nature of the human quest. Our proper quest is to seek the more permanent things, and eventually devote ourselves to God and to the love of God, the glorification of God. But we tend naturally to be distracted by representations of things, by the things themselves. After all, the glory of God fills them. There is something about them that we do recognize as wonderful, as great, and they are very attractive, and naturally so, and rightly so for us. But it's very easy to turn toward them, to turn away from the progress that is supposed to lead us to God. Let's look at Plato to see what he has in mind. There's a famous image in Plato that is at the back of what Augustine is thinking about here. He's thinking about the allegory of the cave and the fact that in Carthage, even though he had the sense there was something greater, he tended to remain in the cave. He was still imprisoned in a situation where his back was toward the light. He was, if not moving in the wrong direction, at least not turning around and recognizing the direction he ought to go. Here's Plato's image. Let's open up the Republic. He says, picture men dwelling in a sort of subterranean cavern with a long entrance open to the light on its entire width. Conceive them as having their legs and necks fettered from childhood so they remain in the same spot, able to look forward only, and prevented by their fetters from turning their heads. Picture further the light from a fire burning higher up, and at a distance behind them. The light is behind them, just the image that we get in Augustine, where he's got his back turned to the light. And between the fire and the prisoners and above them a road, along which a low wall has been built, as the exhibitors of puppet shows have partitions before them in themselves, above which they show the puppets. See also then men carrying past the wall implements of various kinds that rise above the wall, human images and shapes of animals as well, wrought in stone and wood and every material. Some of these bearers presumably speaking, others silent. His interlocutor says, well, a strange image you speak of, and strange prisoners. Like to us, Socrates says. For to begin with, tell me, do you think that these men would have seen anything of themselves or of one another except the shadows cast from the fire on the wall of the cave that fronted them? How could they if they were compelled to hold their heads unmoved throughout life? And again, wouldn't the same be true of the objects carried past? Yes. If then they were able to talk to one another, don't you think they'd suppose that in naming the things they saw, they were naming the passing objects? Necessarily. And if their prison had an echo from the wall opposite them, where one of the passers-by uttered a sound, do you think that they would suppose anything else but the passing shadow to be the speaker? Ah, I don't. Then in every way such prisoners would deem reality to be nothing else than the shadows of the artificial objects. Quite inevitably. That, Augustine is saying, was my condition. I was like a prisoner in this cave. I was seeing the images, the reflections, the shadows, and thinking that they were the realities. Here he has in mind not literally just pictures of things, but he has in mind that visible world, which is itself an image of the more abstract, intelligible world. He says, I had my focus on the visible world. I knew there was something more eternal, something greater. Cicero had taught me that, but I didn't know where to look for it. I kept my attention focused on the shadows, on the images. I did not turn around and recognize the source of the light ultimately being God. Plato continues, consider then what would be the manner of the release and healing from these bonds and this folly, if in the course of nature something of this sort should happen to them. When one was freed from his fetters and compelled to stand up suddenly, and turn his head around and walk, and to lift his eyes up to the light, and doing all this felt pain, because of the dazzle and glitter of the light was unable to discern the objects, whose shadow he formerly saw. What do you suppose would be his answer, if someone told him that what he had seen before was all a cheat and an illusion, but that now, being nearer to reality and turned toward more real things, he saw more truly? And if also one should point out to him each of the passing objects, and constrain him by questions to say what it is, don't you think he'd be at a loss? He'd regard what he formerly saw as more real than the things now pointed out to him? Far more real, he said. And if he were compelled to look at the light itself, wouldn't that pain his eyes? Wouldn't he turn away and flee the things which he is able to discern, and regard them as in very deed more clear and exact than the objects pointed out? It is so. I think what's going on here is that Augustine is saying, I am exactly like that. Cicero had already told me. He had turned my head around and tried to make me look at the light, and I turned back. I couldn't see. I couldn't see the real objects. I couldn't look at the source of light itself. I was just like the prisoners who said, let me turn back toward the shadows, toward the wall, toward something comfortable and familiar, and something that I understand, or at least I think I understand. He couldn't look at that. Now it's even worse if we pulled the prisoners out of the cave. So Socrates continues, if someone should drag him up thence by force, up the ascent which is rough and steep, and not let him go before he had drawn him out into the light of the sun, don't you think he'd find it painful to be haled so long, would chafe at it, and when he came out into the light, that his eyes would be filled with beams so that he wouldn't be able to see even one of the things we call real? There would be a need of habituation to enable him to see the things higher up. At first, he'd most easily discern the shadows. Then, perhaps, the likenesses, reflections in water and other things like that. Then later, the things themselves. From then he might go on to contemplate the appearances in the heavens and heaven itself, more easily by night, looking at the light of the stars and the moon, and then finally the sun and the light of the sun. And so that, in Socrates' mind, is what philosophy does, but it's also what religion does. In Augustine, the thought is this isn't just philosophy leading us up to a more general reflection on the abstract structure of the world. This is what the religious life is like. We turn from the shadows and reflections toward the real things, and finally to the source of light that enables us to perceive them. There's a very deep point here. The classic problem for Platonism is this world is a reflection of this abstract realm of forms. I understand how we come into contact with the objects of this world, how I can come into contact, for example, with this physical book, how I might know something about it. But how do I know something about these abstract forms? He says at one point at the very end of Book 6, well, we see them with the eye of the mind. But that's a puzzling thing. What does it mean, the eye of the mind? We have some kind of relationship, not just to physical triangles, but to the abstract form of triangularity itself, to a pure circle, and not merely things that are circular in the world. But how do we know about those things? And even more acutely, how do we know about the good? How do we know about justice? How do we know about virtue? How do we know about God himself? Those are hard questions. And Plato, at this point, refers really to various kinds of stories, to metaphors, to the good itself shedding light, to the good being analogous to the sun, to us seeing with the eye of the mind. There isn't something that's very satisfying here. But Augustine says it is God that does this. He formulates a doctrine of illumination. It is God that, by acting as the light, illumines our minds. It is God who, like the light of the sun, is able to light our minds. So we can see with something like an eye of the mind, but how is that possible? It is not the causal force of the good of various forms. It is the causal power of God. God enables us to recognize these abstract structures as a way of making progress toward Him. So we have here a picture of the soul inevitably being drawn upward toward God. Now, it's very easy to be distracted, and most people, he says, probably do just get distracted by the various images, by the forms as represented in the reflections in the world, the reflections in physical objects, in the sensual realm. But our souls are restless until they rest in God. We are drawn out of that cave. It is difficult, and he himself says, I felt the draw. It was Cicero who really gave him that sense there was something higher, but he found himself mired in the visible world, unable to make progress in the right direction. That image of, not in this case, being forced painfully out of the cave, but instead being drawn upward, still finding it painful and difficult and wanting to remain down, but nevertheless having something built within us that leads us out to the light of the sun, which is the light of God, that initially we are turned away from. But we can turn and lead ourselves toward that light, the source of all light, which is God.